India and the European Union are all set to announce the conclusion of the free trade agreement today at the India-EU summit that hosts European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council Chief Antonio Costa. Now, the two European leaders were guests of honor at India's 77th Republic Day celebration yesterday. Remember, since 2007, in fact, both sides have been trying to work on closing free trade negotiations, a movement that caught momentum only last year with US President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs across countries, with India facing the steepest 50% tariff on its largest trading partner, the US. Now, today's summit will put in motion India's exports, finding a more lucrative 27-nation European Union market, while lower import costs for Indians buying Europe-made products. Now, India's textile, apparel, leather and gems and jewelry sector hit hard by US tariffs is likely to find breathing room in Europe, while Europe is set to discover a bigger Indian markets for its automobiles as well as spirits. Now, India and EU traded goods worth $136 billion in 2024-25. The two sides expect to more than double that number in coming years. Now, alongside, certain sensitivities are also expected to get ironed out, including the agriculture and dairy sector being kept outside of the ambit of the free trade agreement that India wants to protect. The hefty carbon tax, or CABM, on the steel sector that came into effect this year is likely to see some favorable, if not at least an agreeable conclusion today. So let's put all this in perspective. We have a battery of experts joining us this morning. Barnik Chitran Maitra, PE Investor Managing Partner, Chrysalis Equity. Dr. Jayant Dasgupta, former Indian Ambassador to the WTO. And Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, President, Center for Social and Economic Progress. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on this very important developing story. First up, Mr. Bhandari, let me first begin by asking you $136 billion of trade already between EU and India. What next after the trade deal today gets announced?
Well, the most important is that the rollout, how quickly we are able to achieve that. The FTA is just a signing, and then after that, there is obviously a whole rollout phase. So we'd like to accelerate it because clearly there are going to be immense benefits for India. And it's not just about a few sectors. It's going to be across the board. This is going to be one of the most important FTAs that we have signed, and of course, the one with the most potential. And let me just add, trade and investment tend to go together. So with this FTA, we should also expect a large surge in investment into India and, of course, Indian investments globally.
All right. So investments and not just trade is something which one would await announcements on. But Mr. Jayant Dasgupta, what does this really mean overall in the messaging that India and EU coming together at a critical time like this, when India is slapped with the 50% tariff and Scott Bessent once again not just blaming India, but this time also Europe in saying that both India and Europe are responsible for funding the war in Ukraine?
I think that is only a piece of rhetoric which the US administration and its ministers have been repeating ad nauseum. As far as Russian oil is concerned, the US also buys uranium, palladium, fertilizers, etc. Doesn't that go into the Russian coffers? Just asking this question.
Right.
So the US is blind to its own activities on the trade front and is always trying to point fingers. As far as this EU deal is concerned, it was initiated in 2007 as the BTIA, and then it went into hibernation between 2013 and 2022 for 9 whole years. And 2022, I think it was resumed, and it is now almost concluded. I think 20 out of 24 chapters have been concluded, but a few issues still need to be sorted out. But for the other 20 chapters which have been concluded, legal scrubbing is taking place. So as soon as the other 4 chapters get concluded, the deal will be signed sometime later this year. And it will get implemented after the ratification by the EU Parliament by early next year, 2027. And this is, of course, the EU is the largest partner of India on the trade front. $136 billion, as you mentioned, on goods,
Right.
and another $83 billion in services. So it is much, much larger than the US, which is about $190 billion, and for China as well. So this is, I think, the most significant trade deal that India has ever signed, if I may put it in these words. And another point I wanted to mention is that Canada, with which I think our relations had gone through a trough about 3-4 years ago, Canada is also now wanting to sign a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with India.
Right.
Because it also realizes that with the US, it is on very uncertain grounds.
Absolutely.
And Barnik is coming to India in March, possibly to give a fillip to the talks which have been going on for the past 2 years, but again had been put on hold because of the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
That's right. So a lot happening in the world, and especially with Canada again, which is under threat of now receiving a 100% tariff slip from the US. But Barnik Chitran Maitra, sticking specifically to the India-EU deal, which is likely to see fruition today, there are also these sensitive sectors for which India did not give in to US demands in the context of the India-US trade deal. And I'm really talking about the dairy sector and the agriculture sector. And I think the European Union has made it pretty clear that these two critical sectors, sensitive sectors, have been kept outside of the ambit of India's trade agreement. But what about the carbon tax? That has been a pressing issue. CBAM, which came into effect on the 1st of Jan. Is there likely to be some sort of a formula, some sort of a consensus on how Indian steel exports to Europe can be protected as well?
I don't think I expect a comprehensive formula to be announced today, maybe more an intent to work on this together. As Ambassador Dasgupta mentioned, I think the real devil is in the detail. I think we have to look at the final legal version of the trade agreement, which will be published only 5-6 months from now. I think legal scrubbing will continue from the framework announcement today. But again, knowing how strict Europe is and how serious Europe is about carbon adjustment taxes, I think let us see what they announce. I don't expect there to be a major concession, at least announced today, unless there is more discussion, at least on legality on how to implement and also to ensure parity with similar taxes applied to other trading partners for the European Union. But I think the broader point to note is that what the US should realize is that in the current environment where they are ultra transactional, the rest of the world will figure out a way to trade around the US and trade avoiding the US.
Right.
Where, by the way, as Ambassador Dasgupta pointed out, probably for the last 10-15 years, the US has been India's largest trading partner. This prime position has now been taken over by the European Union. And with today's trade agreement, which will be far more comprehensive than some of the sectors you've covered, which will also cover security defense pacts, which will cover mobility and also likely investment promotion.
Yeah.
I think we expect not only trade, but there will be a great fillip to investments on both sides, with European institutional investors getting access to Indian investments and Indian institutions also getting access to Indian diaspora in Europe,
right,
which creates a far deeper partnership that India has had with Europe, at least on the trade and investment front, than over the last 20 years.
All right, we will come to all these specifics, Barnik, that you mentioned, especially the defense cooperation as well as mobility of Indians in Europe. But to a point that you made just a while earlier, Mr. Laveesh Bhandari, Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, if I can bring you in, should the world actually stand up now and say thank you, President Donald Trump, because had it not been for you and your sweeping tariffs, perhaps these FTAs and all the trade agreements which are happening in the world would have potentially stayed in limbo. So is it time for in a way, to say thank you for the blessing in disguise, President Donald Trump?
Well, yeah, we must thank him, but of course not publicly, because clearly it has accelerated many FTAs globally,
right,
and this one for sure. But I think I would just like to add one more thing on the CBAM. I mean, one must appreciate that the Europe is going to move more and more towards green economy. And CBAM is the one way that it is able to protect itself against non-green products. So it's going to be very difficult for it to give any major freedom to India on CBAM.
All right. If I can bring in Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, sir, the CBAM sort of, expectation, or rather the sort of proposal that India had on the table when the CBAM issue really cropped up about 2 years back was that India said it's better that India taxes the steel exports right here at the source, which is in India, and use those taxes to fund green energy projects. Is that something which you think is practical and likely agreeable by the European Union? Instead of EU taxing India's steel exports, India taxes them at source and uses that money for its own economic development.
From the reports that have emanated from non-official sources, the EU is unlikely to budge on this CBAM because it will involve many other countries on which the EU would be imposing CBAM uniformly. So I don't think there would be any relaxation or waiver given to India, no matter whatever mechanism we suggest about taxing steel and aluminum exports in India and other things.
All right.
So that is one thing. The other point which is emerging is that the EU will give some kind of a solution so that the burden of the CBAM is lightened to a certain extent by providing other means of explaining as to the carbon credits that are accruing in other areas of the industry.
All right.
So that is what is in the offing. But again, I think the details are yet to be worked out, and those form part of the balance 4 chapters which are yet to be finalized.
All right. Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, overall the $136 billion of trade now on account of potentially CBAM, while softening but still adding some pressure on India's steel exports, but the free trade agreement over time likely to aid India's MSME sector, especially leather, textiles, apparel, etc. Do we see some sort of a nullification in trade volume, or do you actually anticipate growth of trade between India and EU?
I expect a major growth.
Can we quantify it, sir? When you say major, can we quantify this 136 billion, let's say after the legal scrubbing, once the deal comes into effect? What is the number that we can potentially target by 2030, let's say?
Well, I wish I could give you a number. I really do. But, we don't know the details of it. Right. It's not even published yet. So it's going to be very difficult. But you're talking definitely about double-digit growth, maybe in the very high double-digit growth. But where it is, of course, we need to know the details. I'd like to add that the taxation solution that you suggested, a variation of that is CBAM compliant. As long as those products are costly enough, Europe may be willing to accept that. So there may be some freedom there.
All right, there could be some freedom, some relaxation, potentially some changing to the formula, but an acceptance from India and from the European Union. Now, coming back, Barnik, to you, you had made this interesting point about mobility of Indians in Europe. Now, this again comes at a time when immigration is a big challenge in the US. So overall, Indians likely to find better job prospects, better educational avenues in Europe with the FTA potentially coming through?
Well, let's look at the details of the deal as to what gets announced. But if you step back and look at services, right, I think services, one of the biggest exports India has. If you look at areas like IT and increasingly other products offered either by our startups or even by traditional services like banking and wealth management, you will see or likely see that there will be a framework which allows Indian professionals to move more freely to Europe to work on short-term projects and even medium-term projects. I don't think there'll be a big win on immigration per se, but in terms of work visas and particularly short-term work visit, there's expectation to be greater mobility. I think one of the biggest priorities, for example, for the Indian IT sector has been to build out Europe as a beachhead over the last 10, 15 years. I think the US market or the North America market has always been 1.5 to 2 times of the European market. One of the biggest rate limiting factors has been the availability and the difficulty of procuring work visas, particularly short-term work visas for Indian professionals to travel to Europe and work in Europe for short-term projects. So let's see what gets announced. I'm quite hopeful that given what's going on with immigration in the US and given that European Union in general is dependent on the world for a lot of its goods and services, they have no other means but to actually free up short-term mobility and create more labor movement mechanisms so that skilled labor, and this is IT professionals, maybe also in other sectors like electronics manufacturing, maybe even in pharmaceutical manufacturing, you will see some sort of mobility. And the standard bane for professionals and investors like us is the ability to procure short-term Schengen visas or short-term visas to travel to the European Union, which have become much harder since COVID, given the processing times and the shorter duration.
Right.
We do expect that some relief may be announced, which will go a good way in terms of boosting Indian service exports, particularly to Europe.
All right. And finally to you, Ambassador Dasgupta, there has been obviously this talk about defense cooperation also building between India and EU. This also comes at a time when, again, thanks to, if I can, use that phrase, thanks to President Donald Trump, all of Europe is also expected to increase its defense budgets. Germany has already stated that it is going to increase it to 5% of its GDP. But overall, at a time when defense spending in NATO across Europe is increasing, this defense cooperation between India and EU, is this likely to further propel the Atmanirbhar defense ambitions of India, Make in India ambitions for India's defense sector, where Indian companies engaged in manufacturing of defense equipment will find a much more lucrative market in Europe?
I think there are several aspects that you have raised. The first one is about technology transfer and co-production. Now, as just a few weeks ago, India was in talks with Germany about submarine or a submarine project.
Right.
And the Germans had promised, apparently, that the submarines could be made partially in India with technology transfer also involved in it.
That's right.
India is likely to place an order for about 114 Rafale fighter jets. And in the first tranche of 36, of course, they came in ready to fly condition. But now I think India will dig its heels in and ask for technology transfer and co-production in India. So these are things which are evolving. And India is unlikely to buy from the Europeans weapons or aircraft, etc., which will not involve a certain degree of technology transfer and co-production as well as offset in India. So all these things will be there. And whether India will be able to sell back to the Europeans, I think that is a debatable question.
Okay.
Because it may take several years before the Indian industry gains that kind of expertise and technology savviness. So that is something which will have to wait for the future.
Absolutely.
As far as the deals which are being talked about with the US on defense procurement, I think India will take a very objective view of procurement. If the equipment is good enough, whether it comes from the US or from Germany or France or
Russia for that matter,
friendly country, or Russia for that matter, we are continuing to buy from Russia.
Absolutely.
So that we will be agnostic about our source of supply, and we'll continue to buy.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that, gentlemen. Barnik Chitran Maitra, Dr. Jayant Dasgupta and Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, pleasure having you here with us on News 9. And thank you so much for your input to that developing story.